In a forgotten town of the American West, where laws were carved in gunfire and prejudice passed down like heirlooms, a white woman dared to love a Cheyenne warrior. And for that love, she was chained, made to ride through town as a warning. But from the far edge of the horizon, a lone rider approached, not with weapons, nor with pleas, but with one thing the town had forgotten: the courage to love. This is a story of defiance, of tenderness, and of a love that refused to bow to hate.
The first snow had barely touched the dirt trails of the frontier town when they dragged her through the main street, barefoot, chained, eyes swollen from wind and humiliation. Her name was Clara Renshaw, once the school teacher with a quiet smile and a shelf of borrowed books. But now they called her something else: witch, traitor, filth. Not because she'd done harm, but because she had loved a man they feared. He was Cheyenne, a tracker with silence in his steps and kindness in his eyes. They said Clara had been seen walking into the woods with him more than once, that she stayed out late and came home with feathers braided into her hair. That was all it took. They burned her cabin the night of the blood moon. Clara barely escaped with a bruised ankle and her mother's locket clenched in her fist. The flames didn't just take her home, they took her dignity, her safety, her place in the only town she had known since she was 12. Now she walked in chains before the same townspeople she once taught to read. The sheriff called it an example. The preacher whispered redemption. And the women, the same who once wept in Clara's arms during harsh winters, now watched in silence. But far out on the ridge, under the shadow of pine and stone, someone else was watching. He hadn't spoken her name in months, but he remembered how she said it, soft as the wind that rustles wheat fields. And he wasn't about to let her vanish into ash. The Cheyenne warrior's name was Tahoma. He had once hunted elk across the snowy ridges and learned to read the silence between snowflakes. A man of few words, he carried his grandfather's knife and his mother's lullabies. And when he first saw Clara, 3 springs ago, she was reading beneath the cottonwood trees, her hair full of sun. They didn't speak for many days, just nods, glances, shared paths in the woods. But kindness bloomed where language failed. Tahoma left bundles of berries on her porch when her cough lingered past winter. Clara, in turn, stitched a lining into his buckskin coat where the wind no longer cut through. No kiss, no vows, just acts of quiet devotion, the kind too sacred for townsfolk to understand. The night they burned her cabin, Tahoma was 10 miles away, teaching a younger cousin to track mountain lions. By the time he returned, smoke had devoured everything: walls, roof, books. All that remained was a single boot in the snow and a trail of bare footprints heading into the night. For days he searched, not in anger, but with the slow, relentless patience of a man who knew what love required. He found the shackles by the well. He smelled iron in the wind. He knew what they had done, and now it was snowing again. Clara sat inside the jailhouse, her wrists red and her silence louder than any prayer. They said she'd be sent east to a sanitarium where women like her were corrected. But what they meant was exile, erasure. The sheriff smoked by the door, proud, said it was best this way, one less bad example for the children. But no one noticed the dark figure on horseback watching from the hill. Tahoma didn't bring an army. He brought something deeper, a memory, a promise,
a fire he carried in silence. That night he lit no torch, gave no warning, just waited, until the snow covered the tracks, until the stars blinked awake. And then he moved.
The sound of hooves was swallowed by the snow. Not a soul stirred as Tahoma approached the town from the northern edge, wrapped in white mist and silence. In his satchel he carried no weapon, only a red-woven blanket and a handful of dried cedar leaves. Around his neck, beneath his shirt, hung a small cloth pouch. Inside, a single lock of Clara's hair, tied with blue thread. It was near midnight when he slipped behind the jailhouse, unseen. Inside, Clara lay curled on the cot, her hands bruised from the cold iron cuffs. Her breath fogged the tiny pane of glass. She hadn't spoken a word in 3 days. Not since they paraded her like an animal. Not since they said Tahoma would never come back. She didn't know how much hope she had left. She didn't know that hope had just dismounted quietly beneath her window. A soft knock came. 2 short taps. She blinked. Again, 2 taps. Clara staggered to the window. Her heart thudded. Then the faintest whisper, almost lost to the wind. Clara. Her name. The way he said it made her knees give way. She pressed her hand to the glass, eyes wide. Tahoma was there, snow-dusted, eyes fierce but gentle. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just reached up and touched the same glass. And for a moment, the chains didn't matter. Neither did the town, the shame, the burn scars, or the preacher's sermons. Only that he had come. Only that he knew. But in stories like theirs, joy never arrives alone. A lantern flickered behind them, then footsteps, fast, heavy. The deputy, half drunk, swung open the back door, rifle drawn. "Hey!" Tahoma didn't flinch. He took 1 slow step back, then another. He didn't run. He bowed, deep and silent, then turned and disappeared into the mist before the bullet could be loaded. Inside, Clara's scream was muffled by her hand. She fell to her knees, the window now empty. Morning came bitter and gray. The preacher gathered the town on the steps of the courthouse. He spoke of cleansing, of sin cast out, of heathen magic and unnatural lust. Clara stood between 2 guards, her wrists bound. They said the train east would come at sundown. They would send her away for good. No trial, no appeal. Just silence. But Clara didn't hear them. Her mind was still at the glass, her breath still fogging the memory of Tahoma's face. Later, alone in her cell, she found something tucked in the corner, beneath a loose brick. A folded square of leather, worn soft with time. Inside she found the red blanket, and wrapped in its folds 3 cedar leaves, a carved bone pendant in the shape of a hawk, and a single word scrawled in Cheyenne script: wait. Her fingers trembled, because somehow that word meant more than any promise. It meant he hadn't given up, and neither would she.
It began with the wind, a strange, still wind at dawn, no longer bitter, no longer cruel. It blew from the west, carrying with it the faintest scent of pine smoke and cedar. By the time the sun crested the ridge, the town was already stirring. Doors opened, eyes squinted toward the horizon. The preacher stepped out, adjusting the collar of his coat. He paused mid-step, frozen by what he saw. A line. No, a procession. 1 man at the front, alone. Behind him, dozens. A line of horses, silent and strong, each bearing a white flag tied to the saddle horn. Some carried old women, some children wrapped in woven blankets. Others rode with faces marked in war paint, though they held no weapons. Among them were wounded veterans, elders, even a priest in Navajo robes. They came not to fight, they came to be seen. And at the front, leading them all, was Tahoma. He did not wear armor nor carry a rifle. Only a simple tunic, his long black hair braided, his horse painted with red earth and feathers. On his chest he bore the same hawk pendant Clara had once touched when they sat by the stream. He stopped at the center of town, dismounted, and stood alone. A silence fell like snowfall. Men peeked from saloon doors, clutching shotguns. Women clutched their children. The sheriff appeared on the boardwalk, rifle in hand but hesitant. Tahoma raised both arms. Then, slowly, without words, he unrolled a bundle in front of the courthouse steps. Inside, cedar branches, a folded white cloth, and a silver ring, shaped like a tiny bird in flight. He didn't speak. He knelt, and with both hands he lifted the ring into the morning light. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not from the ring, but because Clara was already there. In shackles, yes, guarded, yes, but her eyes, those eyes found him like stars through fog. Her knees buckled. The guard reached to steady her, but she shook him off. She stepped forward, one step, then another, and another. Chains dragging, head high. The preacher tried to block her path, shouting words about punishment, disgrace, corruption of bloodlines. But no one listened anymore, because by now the townsfolk weren't watching him. They were watching her. They were watching him.
They were watching what neither law nor sermon could erase: love. Not the easy kind, the kind that endures exile, the kind that walks barefoot through snow, the kind that waits outside a jail cell window with nothing but breath and silence. Clara stopped in front of Tahoma. Tears streaked her face. He looked up. She reached out her hands, still bound, and he simply wrapped her fingers in his. Nothing needed to be said. Not then. The sheriff stepped forward, confused, unsure. And the town, those same townsfolk who had once sneered, who had whispered witch and savage, they did not cheer, but they did not stop it either. They stood quiet. Some looked down. Others nodded. And one, the blacksmith's wife, dropped her apron and walked forward, holding the key to Clara's cuffs. She didn't say a word, just unlocked them, then stepped away. The chains hit the ground like thunder. Clara fell into Tahoma's arms. He wrapped the red blanket around her once more, this time not to save her life, but to begin one.
They left just before dusk. No ceremony, no fanfare. Just the creak of saddle leather, the hush of hooves over frost-softened earth, and the red hue of the blanket draped around Clara's shoulders, swaying gently with each step of the horse. She didn't look back, not at the church where they once whispered her name like a curse, not at the cabin, now a blackened skeleton of ash and beams, not at the faces that had turned away when she had needed them most. But some did watch her go, from behind curtains, behind fences, behind silence. A child waved, an old man tipped his hat. The rest stayed still,
like ghosts uncertain whether to mourn or bless. Tahoma rode beside her, quiet as ever, but his presence was warmth now, not shadow. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. She could feel him there, like the earth beneath her boots, steady and sure. For a while they said nothing. Words were too small, too fragile. They rode through the valley where pine met snow and hawks circled overhead. They passed the place where they had first met, the edge of the frozen stream. Clara glanced at it, her eyes softening. "That day," she finally whispered, "I thought I was dying." He nodded, reins in one hand. "You were." She looked at him. "And now?" He met her gaze. "You're becoming." She smiled through tears. They reached a ridge just as the sun began to fall behind the mountains, casting gold across the plains. There, below them, stretched a quiet meadow, nestled in the folds of the land like something forgotten but sacred. It was a place few knew, and it would be theirs. A few poles had already been raised, frames of a new cabin, not large, not grand, but waiting. Together they dismounted. Clara walked forward, touching one of the beams. Her fingers brushed the rough wood. "Did you build this?" He said. "I started." She turned to him. "Why?" Tahoma's voice was low. "Because I knew you'd come."
They left just before dusk. No ceremony, no fanfare. Just the creak of saddle leather, the hush of hooves over frost-softened earth, and the red hue of the blanket draped around Clara's shoulders, swaying gently with each step of the horse. She didn't look back, not at the church where they once whispered her name like a curse, not at the cabin, now a blackened skeleton of ash and beams, not at the faces that had turned away when she had needed them most. But some did watch her go, from behind curtains, behind fences, behind silence. A child waved, an old man tipped his hat. The rest stayed still, like ghosts uncertain whether to mourn or bless. Tahoma rode beside her, quiet as ever, but his presence was warmth now, not shadow. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. She could feel him there, like the earth beneath her boots, steady and sure. For a while they said nothing. Words were too small, too fragile. They rode through the valley where pine met snow and hawks circled overhead. They passed the place where they had first met, the edge of the frozen stream. Clara glanced at it, her eyes softening. "That day," she finally whispered, "I thought I was dying." He nodded, reins in one hand. "You were." She looked at him. "And now?" He met her gaze. "You're becoming." She smiled through tears. They reached a ridge just as the sun began to fall behind the mountains, casting gold across the plains. There, below them, stretched a quiet meadow, nestled in the folds of the land like something forgotten but sacred. It was a place few knew, and it would be theirs. A few poles had already been raised, frames of a new cabin, not large, not grand, but waiting. Together they dismounted. Clara walked forward, touching one of the beams. Her fingers brushed the rough wood. "Did you build this?" He said. "I started." She turned to him. "Why?" Tahoma's voice was low. "Because I knew you'd come." When they left the land that once burned her home, they didn't carry bitterness. They carried something else. The scent of a campfire, a child's laughter, and a beginning no one thought possible. Sometimes love doesn't need to win. It just needs to exist, even where it's never been welcomed. And if you've ever felt cast out for loving differently, remember, someone, somewhere, may already be riding through 100 winds of dust to find you. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share, so more stories like this can bring healing where it's needed most. We'll see you in the next video.